Thank you, Maria. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's so exciting to be with you and to be talking about this topic and focusing on something that is near and dear to my heart. And I'm just thrilled to be able to have this conversation and introduce you to Julia Skinner. Julia she's the author of Our Fermented Lives, and I'm sure everyone has realized that. So because we're highlighting, this is definitely a book launch for her. Her book was released in September, so it's newly released, and it's a beautiful book. I've been reading it for the past week and a half, trying to get familiar with it and look at the recipes and just the information. So I think we're in for a really juicy evening talking to her about her book. First, I am going to actually read you her bio so I don't miss anything, and so you can get familiar with her. So Julia is the founder of Root Kitchens, and she is the author of Our Fermented Lives. She is also the author of A History of How. Oh, that's the subtitle. Sorry, let me read that again, because subtitles are very important to books, right, Julia? Yeah. They often tell more of the story than the actual title. So let me read this properly. The book is called Our Fermented Lives, A History of How Fermented Foods Have Shaped Cultures and Communities. Through Root, Julia offers classes on fermentation, on food waste reduction, and traditional cooking techniques, as well as consulting. She offers private lessons, and she offers a membership with recipes, a newsletter, and more. And we'll be putting her contact information in the chat as we go along, so you can check out some of those things that she offers. As a writer, she covers fermentation history and is always curious about the stories behind our food. She has also written and illustrated The Hidden Cosmos, a fermentation oracle and recipe deck, which I really adore. I have a copy of that myself. And she also has written Afternoon Tea, a history, as well as numerous other books and articles. And like I said, we will be putting her contact information into the chat. So I was really interested in talking to Julia for a couple reasons, specifically her curiosity about a history of fermentation in communities. This is just such an intriguing thing, and of course the microbes are part of that community, we're part of that community, all of those things. So if you don't win the book tonight and you don't have it, make sure you go and get it. Here it is. It's a beautiful book, and I really highly recommend it. And then her, The Hidden Cosmos, the fermentation oracle deck, is right here. And so I highly recommend that you get that too. I thought it was curious that there was a fermentation oracle deck. And at first I was like, oh, that's so odd. I wonder how that works. And then I pulled a card and I was really intrigued and excited about it. So welcome, Julia. I was hoping that maybe I don't know if you have your oracle deck there. If you don't, I can pull a card, but I was hoping we could pull a card together to start the evening.
Yeah, maybe if you want to pull one. Mine is actually in the other room.
Okay.
But yeah, if you want to pull a card for us.
Yes, just kind of see what what's in store for us this evening. Because even though we talk a little bit about this, everyone, we don't know entirely what's in store. We'll let the conversation lead us. So I've got the deck here, I'm shuffling it, and I'm gonna go ahead and everyone put your intention out there, and we'll see what we come up with here further. Okay. So then I have to go to the book and look it up. So what a fun thing to really look at using fermentation as an oracle. I just really love it. So let me see what we've got here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So here's what we got. We got Mead of Inspiration and Poetry. Lovely. So this is the card. Do you ever wonder where inspiration and poetry come from? According to Norse mythology, they come from a very special mead, brewed by the gods and shared with humans. Mead is sweet, but not always, and intoxicating, it reminds us, sorry, I lost my place for a second there. It reminds us of those things that bring us sweetness and joy. So the inquiry here is, what adds so much goodness to your life that you feel almost drunk with happiness? Feel gratitude for these things and focus your attention on nurturing them. You might find some new inspiration as a result. That is just lovely, Julia. Thank you.
Yeah, that seems like a good fortune for this evening.
I think so. So joy and sweetness. And
Yeah.
so why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey to writing the book, and what inspired you to write about fermentation and learn about the history of fermentation?
Yeah, so I've been fermenting food for probably about 20 years. And when I started, I learned from friends, as many of us did. We learned from people in our lives. And then I started getting books and I started learning more, kind of diving more into it. The more and more I got into it, the more that I became curious about the history. I've been a food historian for a while. I've studied history in other ways as well. My dissertation was the history of a specific library, so I do history kind of as a big part of my life. And as I was researching and kind of figuring out what I might write a book about, it occurred to me that there wasn't a history of fermentation. And so I had been kind of wondering for a while, like, oh, it'd be nice to write a book, but like, I don't know. I've written a couple. I don't know what the next one would be on. And then kind of just had this moment of like, oh, fermentation history. The history is kind of interspersed in places, but nobody's really just written the history as the primary topic. So that was kind of how we got here.
Nice. And I love that, with your subtitle, How Fermented Foods Have Shaped Cultures and Communities. I really am intrigued by that. And I'm wondering, could you just share with us a couple things about that you discovered in your research that maybe surprised you or brought you joy?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways fermentation has shaped our lives. Something that Sandra talks about in the foreword is that we've co-evolved with these microbes. And so we've had our relationship with these microbes is both us evolving from bacteria and kind of like that we have become such a drastically different thing from bacteria speaks to possibility and speaks to that anything really is possible. And I think that's very interesting. That we still have a close relationship with them biologically, vis-a-vis our microbiome. That I found that to be very interesting. And then when we look at the ways that we eat food, for example, all the ways that we've used beer to help make water safe. We've used beer to provide us B vitamins and, also to get drunk off of.
To bring joy.
Yeah, lots of purposes.
Yes. Well, and actually, being an organization that's herbally focused, I'm aware of the history of beer and different herbs being utilized to preserve the herbs as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're probably familiar with Stephen Buhner's beautiful book, Sacred Herbal Healing Beers, which I really enjoy that aspect of that book.
Yeah. Yeah, and I found it interesting. That book was actually where I learned that fermenting in brews, fermenting different herbs in brews will sometimes alter their medicinal properties somewhat. And so that I found that very interesting too. I'm sure you know way more about that aspect of it than I do, but
well, yeah,
I think
because
yarrow was a specific one that he mentioned.
Right, and that some other herbs were used for that bittering agent, not just hops. And we landed on hops. And actually, that I'm not positive why we chose hops. Do you have any information about that?
So yeah, so we prior to hops, European beers used what was called gruit, which depending where you were was different blends of bittering herbs. And so yeah, we would use these bittering herbs, and then at some point, I think was it Charlemagne that was really into hops, and advocated for them. And then, but many people didn't use hops still. And then eventually, I think we settled on them in part because they had a stronger preservative effect than some of the other herbs that we were using. And so when we think about things like an India Pale Ale, the reason why it was an India Pale Ale is because there was a bunch of hops thrown in it to help it last for longer on longer sea voyages. So kind of an interesting story there. But yeah, King Henry VIII, for example, hated hops. He didn't want us to use hops in our beer. He wanted, good old English ale to have other stuff in it. So
Interesting.
story, yeah.
So one of the things that's interested me when you talk about preserving things to travel across the seas, I know sauerkraut was a big part of that. And I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so sauerkraut story is interesting because I think when we think of sauerkraut today, we think of, Germany, various parts of Eastern Europe. Sauerkraut itself, what we think happened, all the evidence we have points to it actually originating in China, in Mongolia. And so in Mongolia, you had people coming and conquering Eastern Europe. You had people conquering all of these spaces and bringing what this preserved cabbage that they were making that was preserved in rice wine vinegar. And so it was basically like a quick pickled cabbage as opposed to the salt fermented cabbage we know today. And so they brought this down, and it's an example of one of the many ways that we share foods across cultures, and not all of them being, super happy and positive, right? But the foods do still share across the cultures even in those moments. And so they brought this pickled cabbage. People liked it, but then, rice wine vinegar isn't something that was probably very easy to get in, say, Eastern Europe at that time. And so they worked with what they had, and what they had was salt. And so we had it evolve into what we know today.
Well, one of the things I understand as well is that they carried cabbage across the sea as because it produces vitamin C when it's fermenting, that it helped to prevent scurvy because people didn't have access to fresh food, so they didn't have vitamin C in their diet, and that was one of the purposes, or maybe it was more of a byproduct at first of carrying sauerkraut across the ocean.
Yeah, that, that and just any vegetables and roughage you could get in your diet when you're on the ocean was probably very welcome.
Right, absolutely. So I want to back up just a little bit because I know when we were preparing for the call tonight, I realized in some of the responses we got that we may have a real wide spectrum of folks on this call. Some people are already fermenting a lot of things, some people just starting out their journey. And I wondered if maybe we could talk a little bit about the fermentation process itself and the safety of it, because that's one of the things that has always really heartened me, is that it's really a safe way to preserve food, safer than most people would think. And so I wondered if you could just go back to basics a little bit and talk about that, and maybe throw in a little bit of history and science to stretch the people who are not so new.
Yes. Yeah, and if you have other tips too, I think we both, obviously have plenty to say. We've both been fermenting forever, but yeah, so I always turn to Sanders' definition of fermentation as the transformative action of microbes, because most other definitions ask us to only think about some kinds of fermentation, and that encompasses it fully. And so that transformation aspect is key. What we're trying to do is make cabbage into sauerkraut, make milk into yogurt, make grains into beer, make something into something. And it tends, it's not an overnight process, and sometimes it is, typically not, but it's it tends to be somewhat slow, and very safe too. There's, especially with fruit and vegetable fermentation, if it's off, you will know it's off. It will smell bad. It will have like fuzzy, colorful molds on it, which you should not eat. things like that, and I always tell people to trust their senses and trust themselves. When we get to things like meat fermentation, it does require a little more specialized consideration. But for something like sauerkraut, I mean, really just trust your senses. And, if you're not sure about it, don't eat it. But it's so safe to do. And I mean, I've been making sauerkraut, like I said, for 20 years. I've never gotten sick off of eating it, and I've eaten, I don't even know how much sauerkraut at this point. I've made it thousands of times, probably.
Me as well. Well, a couple of things I often mention to people on the topic of safety is the concept of a sensory quorum. And this is why we inoculate ferments, and we inoculate them with microbes that we know are active and are effective and have certain flavors and effects, is that bacteria, when they meet a similar bacteria, they grow exponentially. And that's how some of the pathogenic bacteria can be crowded out when you have the beneficial bacteria growing. And so, like when we make yogurt and we inoculate the milk with our bacterial cultures, we know that that's what's going to grow in there are the beneficial bacteria. And the other piece is having carbohydrates and sugars present, and that's where the meat fermentation gets tricky, because you have to introduce something that to a substrate to ferment onto, right? So just talking, like, I often think about that too. Like when I make sauerkraut, if I add carrots, it goes faster because the carrots are higher in carbohydrates than the cabbage itself, where the cabbage, you're relying more on the cellulose. So yeah, it's so interesting. You can do it from your senses and the basics, and then understanding a little bit about what's happening seems really helpful to me.
Yeah, and there's just such a wide variety of ferments, and at this point, so many good resources too, which, I mean, I'm sure when you were starting out, when I was starting out, there were fermentation books, but they're not like there are today. I mean, it wasn't like you had sections of bookstores that had, preserving books like we do now.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think it makes it a lot easier to get good guidance.
Well, speaking of different types of ferments, when we met in preparation for our conversation here, we talked about condiments, and I wondered if maybe we could have a conversation about that and
Yeah.
mention your recipe, which I was excited about, which is mushroom ketchup.
Yeah, so we had talked about mushroom ketchup because Linda had asked if I had any mushroom recipes in here. I was like, oh wait, I have mushroom ketchup. And so mushroom ketchup is really interesting because it's the precursor to tomato ketchup. So ketchup itself has this very interesting history. It's initially based in Chinese fish sauce that was brought over to England via trade. And once it got to England, people were like, wow, we like this stuff. For some reason, even though England, I mean, they have fish in England, right? But they decided to make it with other things as well. They did make some fish sauces, but they were like, let's branch out and also make this with other things. And so you have, in the early modern period, in like the 1600s, this really wide variety of different sauces and condiments made with walnuts, mushrooms, like all these different things that they were like, let's try making a fish sauce equivalent, like this savory amino sauce sort of thing, out of whatever. And so the mushroom ketchup is interesting because you basically ferment it for a short period, and then you cook it down with vinegar and spices, and it tastes very much, and it is actually a precursor to Worcestershire sauce, and so it's kind of a similar flavor profile. And so that was ketchup for a long time, and then eventually, because tomatoes, we don't always think of it this way, but tomatoes, especially tomato seeds and pulp, have a lot of umami, and so tomatoes were another thing that they were using. And then Heinz at one of the state fairs, the World's Fair, introduced a commercially made tomato ketchup, and then he was like, oh, we have this savory ketchup, and now it's kind of sweet and savory, and so it's crowded out all the other ketchups. that's how we got to where we are. I have also in the book a fermented tomato ketchup. Honestly, when I make tomato ketchup, I don't make it that often. I just buy it, but I make mushroom ketchup a lot.
Nice. Well, I know I make a lot of different condiments and really love to have them out on the table. And one of the things I use as a condiment is miso. And I often put that out on the table. You can use it as a spread. You can use it in sauces, add it to any soup. And I was wondering if you have a little bit to say about miso and utilizing that and or making it.
Yeah, so miso, I've only been making miso for about 4 or 5 years, but I love making it. I was surprised at how easy it is to make.
Me too. I had this impression it was really hard,
Yeah.
and then I did it, and it's so much simpler than I thought.
Yeah. I was like, for some reason, I thought koji fermentation, I guess because it was mold-based and I hadn't done a lot with mold-based stuff, I always assumed it was a lot harder than it is. And it's really, I mean, making your own soy sauce, making your own amazake and your own miso and all these different things is actually not that hard. Yeah, and so with miso, I mean, you basically just make this bean paste with this koji and you pack it in, you push all the air out and you let it ferment. And how long you let it ferment, can influence what its final flavor is. So the longer you let it ferment, the more deep kind of umami flavors you get in those beans. And a lot of us make misos with all kinds of different stuff. I have one, Kirsten Shockey, who's one of my friends and another fermentation author. She made a toasted sourdough miso. And so I've started making that, and it's you use the same miso making process, but with your leftover sourdough, and you like crisp it up and soak it and use it like you would cooked beans. Really, really good. I have a ton of that right now.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and it's great. I like using those kinds of misos in soups in different, rather than making, because I make a lot of white miso soup and just have that all the time, but I'll use something like that. Sourdough miso is the basis of like a vegetable stew or something to kind of add some richness. Or, I really like it in dressings, really any marinade. It's really good in like chocolate chip cookies and baked goods. Miso is really good in there. It's so much more versatile than I think we assume it might be.
And it's so interesting to me because I found that too, like even adding these umami flavors to sweets is really a nice combination. And it's not something I think in the Western diet, it's we either go for sweet or, salty, and we don't always think of them even together. And so, yeah, I really enjoy doing that as well. And I know when I was at the residency with Sandor Katz, I had tasted some nut miso, which I really, I haven't played with it, but it's something that's on one, in my list of agenda of things to do.
Yeah, it's really good. I just actually made a sunflower seed one, so I realized I had a lot of sunflower seeds. I had like quarts and quarts of them, and I was like, okay, I should do something before these all go rancid. And yeah, again, very, very easy. You just, you soak them and yeah, blend it up and add your koji. Very, very simple. Yeah, and versatile too. Those nut misos in particular, I really, really like with fresh vegetables and roasted vegetables. They go really well with them.
They really do. It's such a nice combination. So I wanted to go back to something you were saying. You were talking about the sourdough miso, which is intriguing to me. And one of the things I hear all the time is people are like, what do I do with all of this sourdough? And it was something that Sandor talked a lot about when I spent time with him, was like, what, we made sourdough soup when I was there. And I was like, oh, this is so intriguing. So sourdough, miso, this is a great idea. And I'm just wondering if you have any other tips for those bread makers who are wondering, what do we do with our
Well, I mean, if we think, if we look back into history, something that's very good is kvass. And so beet kvass, I think, is the one that we most often know, but kvass can also just be made with bread or beets and bread or carrots and bread or what, but it's basically, so kvass is basically a sparkling non-alcoholic beverage. So you get, it's a probiotic beverage, and it's like salty, savory, really, really good. That's a good way to use sourdough. Trying to think how else I've been using sourdough lately. I mean, really the miso has been the bulk of it. I just love the sourdough miso so much.
Well, I know I make bread, but I also make crackers and pancakes and waffles and
Yeah.
all of those things, and biscuits. I make a sourdough biscuit, so you can kind of stretch out sourdough muffins, and granted they're bread products, but still, like, it's easy to sometimes to
Yeah.
crackers rather than a loaf of bread.
So it looks like we have a couple people asking what is koji.
It's koji. Yeah, that's why my hand was up. I wanted to bring that to your attention.
So yeah, so I'm also glad to see that Aurora brought up South River Miso, who sell koji. So if you decide to go on a koji making journey, they don't ship in summer, as she mentioned. But yes, they have very good koji. I use theirs a lot. But so koji is Aspergillus oryzae, and it's a mold, and it's used to ferment I mean a ton of stuff, but including miso, soy sauce, amazake, sake, plenty of different things. Some people use it in fish sauce, some people use it for charcuterie. It's very, very versatile, and so it's a fermentation mold, so you're using a mold rather than bacteria.
And it's typically grown on rice. So you first you grow the mold on rice, and that's what you can purchase from South River Miso, is the actual rice that's already been inoculated with the mold. You also can buy mold spores yourself and play around with inoculating. And being that we live in the Midwest, where a lot of people harvest wild, at least foragers harvest wild rice, I've been playing around with inoculating wild rice with the koji, which is kind of fun. So along those lines, do you want to talk a little bit about foraging and adding wild edibles to your ferments?
Yeah. Yeah, so I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and so we're very blessed that we can forage year round here, which is great. And so right now, if I were to walk outside my door and it wasn't, too dark to see what I was doing, there's violet leaves are a big thing right now. And just like in the Midwest, also, like barks, like we have, a lot of mimosa bark. There's a big mimosa tree right next to my house. And all these other things. Chickweed is coming up right now. We have 2 seasons of chickweed. We have springtime and fall chickweed. Goldenrod just finished. Yeah, and it's great because I think, wherever you are in the world, we can all incorporate these wonderful flavors into our food, and fermentation allows us a way to get really creative with that and to reuse maybe parts of those things that were like, oh, I gathered too much, let's say chickweed. I don't, there's only so much pesto I can eat. Well, all you have to do, because vinegar is such a good extractive for minerals, and chickweed is such a mineral heavy food, you can just pack that in a jar and put some unpasteurized vinegar on it, and congratulations, let it sit a month and you've got this delicious mineral rich vinegar that you can use. I've also found those vinegars, this is not always true with everything, but I find every time that I make a chickweed vinegar, it always just like grows vinegar mothers like crazy for some reason. Like they're just like, they both really like to be with each other. Goldenrod vinegar is also really good. I use that in cocktails and mocktails a lot. It's kind of a nice piney, herbaceous sort of flavor. Yeah. And, and it's so fun. And it's a good way to use up invasive edibles too. I'm sure many people in here are probably familiar with Pascal Bauder's argument that when we, instead of dealing with invasive species by treating them as food, we just like spray them with pesticides, we're not only causing environmental damage, but it's also food waste. And so here's a way that we can use these things in a way that's more environmentally responsible. And fermentation, like making mustards, you can play with the greens, you can take the seeds and make mustard. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. And I'm sure, Linda, up there you have tons of different things you do too.
Oh, absolutely. And the vinegars are definitely a big part of what I do. And, I make garlic mustard vinegar with the whole plant, and I agree with you. Instead of, spraying chemicals or hating plants, just, eat them, eat your weeds.
Yeah.
And bring them into your everyday diet. And I love, we were talking about South River miso earlier. I mean, one of their signature misos has dandelion, nettle, seaweed, and wild leeks in it. And I've done that with my misos. I've added those things to my own miso that I make. And it's fun. And then it adds deep extra nutrition, which is, a big part of my passion for sure, is increasing the nutrient density of my food as much as possible. And adding the wild foods is just such a big part of that.
Yeah, and I do, when we talk about invasives, one of our invasives here is mimosa, which I know there's a bunch of different things called mimosa. In this case, I'm talking about Albizia julibrissin, the happiness tree, or there's a lot of different names for it, but with the little fluffy, cute flowers. And I absolutely love these trees. I think they're gorgeous. I also recognize that these trees are invasive, and so I don't worry about harvesting too many of the flowers because they're everywhere. But the flowers are really, really good medicine. And so I'll harvest a bunch of them. I'll make meads and sodas and tinctures and all these things. And about once a year, I have friends over, and I just have this kind of gathering where we like cook food and we just have all of these mimosa beverages, and like everybody's just in a great mood when we leave because we've had all this mimosa. It's really nice.
Yes, absolutely. And, I wonder, maybe, we're talking about making ferments and, a relationship with them. And I think one of the relationships well, let me just back up a second. Having a relationship is really important with this food. I always joke that it's different. My 50s grandmother, she was in the 1950s, loved TV dinners because they were so easy. And she didn't have to have a relationship with that food. And whereas when you're fermenting things, you need to have a relationship and you need to watch what's happening and pulse it, and which I love. That's something I really enjoy. And so I was wondering if you could talk some about the relationship as far as storing the food and when to move it to one place to the other, and maybe even a little bit of the history of that, because I think there's a lot of people I know have questions about that.
Yeah, so I'll kind of give a few things, then we can dive in other directions as we want. When I think about relationship and storing food, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, seasonality, which we are not as tied to as we have historically been. And, so there's different things that we put up in different seasons. And so, things like chickweed vinegar, provided you have chickweed growing, can be put up whenever, and that's fine. But there's other things. So when we talked about miso, if we want to make a longer aged miso, those work better in cooler weather. You want all of these things to be in room temperature. You want them to be comfortable. I always give people kind of the guidance of, if you are comfortable in a space, your ferments are probably comfortable. If you're super hot or super cold, they're probably not comfortable either. but as long as you're, moderately comfortable, they're probably fine. And, so this is, we have root cellars for this reason. And so when I think about seasonality and moving things that I don't want to have get really hot, I will put, of course, in my fridge. You put things in your fridge when they're done fermenting. and that keeps them a certain temperature. If you have a root cellar, they can go in there. Yeah, but I think, thinking about that seasonality and thinking when we think about relationship, it's not just our relationship with the seasons, it's our relationship with the food itself. It's our relationship with taking these ingredients we care about and turning them into something new and something that is a collaboration. We are working with these microbes. We can set up the environment for them to do what we want them to do. And sometimes they just won't feel like it. They just won't want to. Most of the time they do. So if you have never fermented before, don't feel like that's discouraging. But once in a great while, your ferment will just not feel like doing the thing. And it's an opportunity to learn about, okay, maybe I let this sit out too long. Oh, it turns out I set this in direct sunlight and didn't realize it. Or, oh, whatever. And so then you learn, there's no failure. We don't have to feel bad, but it allows us, because of that relationship, allows us to learn, allows us to store our food in a way that is more responsible and delicious.
Right. It's been so interesting to me because since I've been on my fermentation journey, I've moved to dramatically different regions, and that's been interesting to me to see what does well. Like when I first moved here from the Pacific Northwest, the first year I had my sourdough starter out on my kitchen table, and I came out in the morning on the hottest day of the year and it was all over the kitchen table. And that never happened in the Pacific Northwest. So you really, when you change regions and then your relationship shifts, and things even tasted different when I changed regions as well.
Yeah, so I lived in Iowa for about 10 years, and that's when I started fermenting. And then I moved to Florida, so very different. And then up here to Atlanta. And I mean, when I moved to Florida, I moved there in July in a car that had no AC. It was an 18-hour drive, I think. And so the ferments that, like my sourdough starter that came with me on that journey, I mean, all of us were pretty hot and tired by the time we got to the house. And but it was things fermented a lot faster, things tasted differently. And part of that had to do with that just wherever you are, the microbial kind of fingerprint of each place you are will be slightly different. But also, like we were talking about before, the heat and the different temperature considerations and environmental considerations that go into that. Something in Florida and also here that I didn't have to deal with to the same extent in Iowa was the bugs, just so many bugs all the time. I mean, I cover things and so fruit flies don't get in them and multiply, but just I feel like if I'm ever at all remiss in that for a second, it becomes a problem so much more quickly here than it ever was up there.
Well, I find it really interesting. I know a person who teaches fermentation in this region, and he encourages people to capitalize if they want to make vinegar on fruit flies, and encourages them. So it's this interesting thing because they carry, the microbes that actually transform things into vinegar, which is why winemakers, really are very unhappy when fruit flies show up into their wine cellar.
Yeah. No, if they didn't multiply and make my kitchen so unlivable, I would be happy to welcome them. But we have year-round, we have mosquitoes probably 11 months of the year here, so it's a different world that I'm used to.
Yes, I mean, just changing those regions. And then if you think about it, you have to, one of the things I've noticed too is when I've moved to a couple different, even in the same region, still my space needs to become inoculated or get that imprint. And when I've lived somewhere for a while, I'll cultivate that and then I'll move and then I have to cultivate that again. And, being someone who's really interested in the, microbes for health, And, the beneficial bacteria, I think about that with our guts too, like if we're moving or transforming or shifting, that it may take time also for our gut microbes to catch up with us and populate correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about even just traveling places, when I'm traveling, I eat, a ton of ferments most of the time, but when I'm traveling, depending where I'm going, maybe not as much. Yeah, and so I don't normally take probiotic pills for a number of reasons. One being that I think single strain probiotics aren't as robustly healthy for our guts as a variety of microbes. But there are some that are multi-strain probiotics. And so if I'm going to be traveling somewhere and I know that I'm going to not have access to my normal store of ferments, I'll actually bring some of those with me for that reason, so that my gut microbiome can continue to kind of get the probiotic, and then I bring fiber too for prebiotics.
Sure, absolutely. And for digestion, when we put things in our ferments, we can capitalize on putting those prebiotics like I try to put a lot of inulin or algin or those things in my ferments to optimize them, and they can just be this powerhouse of nutritional density when you add a lot of different things. Like I like to add burdock to my sauerkraut, things like that to really increase, because that's really high in inulin and minerals. And so, yeah, it's such a intriguing process.
Yeah. Well, and when we think about a lot of traditional fermented foods, a lot of them are both prebiotic and probiotic. Sauerkraut, like you just said, kimchi, like a lot of them have both. And I always find it interesting when we think about that, because it's like our ancestors knew what they were doing, even if they didn't fully understand the science behind it. Like they had a sense of that this was the thing they needed to be doing.
Well, and it's, for health, but it's also was a preservation technique, kind of what you talked about before about the seasonality. And if I want to have cabbage in, February in this region, it's a really good idea to make sauerkraut.
Yep.
So that you have it. And, that's one of the benefits of fermentation is its preservation qualities, and one way to preserve food. And I know you talked about refrigerating your ferments. One of the reasons I ferment is because I don't always have room in my refrigerator. So creating a space like a root cellar space to be able to store them, because you don't have to have a refrigerator. You can store them in a cool place. If you create that space, you can, store lots of ferments. I do that during the winter months. So
yeah. Yeah, no, and there was I remember Sandor was talking about when I was at my residency with him, that there was somebody who had, one of his former residency students who was from Puerto Rico, and one of the hurricanes that had knocked out all of the power there, she was the only one of her neighbors who really had any food because she fermented, and so she still had viable food after several days, whereas everybody else, had like milk and eggs and stuff in their fridge. And, once you refrigerate eggs, you can't put them back out on the counter. So they just didn't have food anymore. And she was like, well, I'm fine. I made all this sauerkraut. So she was very popular with her neighbors, apparently.
Right. Well, and that's a kind of a broader topic. We probably could do a whole session on this, but I'll just mention it briefly. Is learning to store food without refrigeration is a really good skill. And I've lived on land where we didn't have refrigeration. So knowing that if you don't put eggs in the fridge, you don't have to, and you can leave them out. And, I was taught to just rotate them like the mother hen does. So just that relationship with the food, and really, knowing how things will store, and so that you can have them later is a whole skill and whole world in of itself. And I love, so when I, was looking at your background and thinking about how it looks like you've been really interested in like that food waste stream and being able to reuse and access. And I wondered if you have any recipes in your book that you want to highlight or underscore in that realm.
Yeah, so I actually have sitting next to me off screen, I have some show and tell stuff that is actually food waste related. So I will pull that up because I think that will be a useful thing here. So I'm sure many people here are familiar with fire cider. But here's one I'm working on right now. And so for people who don't know what fire cider is, it is an unpasteurized apple cider vinegar. It's typically what we use. But you just want to pack as much goodness as you can in here. Hot peppers, garlic. This one has citrus and herbs and peppercorns and onions and all kinds of stuff. And it, I mean, there's as many recipes for fire cider as, as there are people who make it. But it's a very, very wonderful health tonic that I absolutely love. And it actually also has a really interesting history we can get into at some point if we feel so called. But as we all know, when you make an infused vinegar, you strain all that stuff out. And so, if we think about this jar, all of this is getting strained out. Well, what are we going to do with all of that? And there's a few things, you can blend it up and use it as a marinade for, say, meats or vegetables or something. What I tend to do is I dehydrate it. And so I have a little kind of sample jar here of, this is from my last batch. And this is just all that same stuff, citrus and hot peppers and everything that I've dried out. And I just put it in. I have a dehydrator. You can also use your oven on the lowest setting or a solar dehydrator or whatever. And then I grind it. I use a coffee grinder that is not the same one I use for my coffee. And I just make seasoning blends out of it. And this is what my family gets for gifts every year, is whatever I made into infused vinegars, they get eventually powdered in jars. And that's their holiday gifts. And they seem to like it, which is great.
That's a wonderful idea.
Yeah, cheap too, which is also I'm really into.
Absolutely. And I think people know what to do with some powdered spice something, because a lot of times if you gave them a ferment, like say you gave them that jar,
right, they'd be like
what?
Yeah, like, but well, the nice thing too, when we go back to infused vinegars, one of my favorite ones to make is if I make something, I tend to make things with strawberries and jalapenos around the same time, if not the same dish. And so I'll make strawberry top and jalapeno top vinegars, and I'll mix them together. And it's absolutely delicious. But then I can take those tops and I can make another seasoning blend too. And that's nice. I mean, I like that on cocktails. I like that. I mean, again, just kind of on, salads or on whatever. I mean, yeah, like you said, people tend to be more creative when you give them a seasoning blend, as opposed to when I give people a vinegar, when I'm just like, here's, I infused this vinegar for you and I did all of this, and they're just like, they don't know what to do unless they're over.
People ask me all the time, what do I do with vinegar? I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a million things.
Everything.
But people don't put that together. So I love that. I know one of my favorite ingredients I'm not a big pepper fan, so I usually use horseradish for the heat. And so then it really, if you blend it up, it makes like a horseradish sauce. And so you can utilize that to, just like you would any other horseradish, and you have some of the other ingredients in there. So yeah, it's a great way to work with that. And it's of course a remedy if you have a cold or a flu. It really can stop it in its tracks really quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a spoonful of it every day this time of year, just seasons changing, trying to make sure everything stays healthy.
Yeah, the last time I made some, which was recently, I just opened it up to see how it was doing, and just smelling it opened up my sense. I didn't even have to ingest it. Yeah. So do you have any other show and tells for us?
Yeah, let's see what else I've got down here. Yeah, so kind of going back to foraging, I was going to loosen the cap on this. I'm not going to because it's kind of full. So this is, you can't really see it probably super well, but these are pieces of mimosa bark from a mimosa branch that I cut down off that tree I mentioned, along with some rose hips. And this is just a mead that I'm making. So again, when we think about both foraging and food waste, those rose hips were from a bush that was dying, but that had put out hips. And so I was like, okay, well, don't want those to go to waste. And then this branch I cut down as part of kind of my pruning practice. And so, out of that, I was able to make this medicinal herbal mead, and not waste those. So that's one. Let's see.
Did you use a sweetener in that? Was it plain honey?
Just plain honey. I can't remember which honey I used in that particular one. I think just a wildflower honey of some sort.
Okay, great.
But yeah, I normally have, like a dozen kinds of honey at the house at any one time.
I know, it's amazing how many different types of and flavors of honey there are. Yeah.
Well, and we're really blessed because we can get Tupelo honey down here, which is one of my favorites. And so, yeah, I make a lot of Tupelo honey things.
Nice.
Yeah, so this one, so when we were talking about different places tasting different ways, I call this one my adventure ferment. This has been with me. So I started this in, was it late 2018, early 2019? It was right after my grandma passed, and I was like packing up her house and like all of this stuff. And I put the last of the vegetables that she had in her house into a brine as I was driving, and then drove back up to my house. And then ever since then, I've brought this brine with me everywhere I've traveled, even overseas. And so it's been with me. I mean, I bring like a little vial of it. I don't like bring this whole jar, but I'll bring like a little vial, and I'll like find an edible plant wherever I'm traveling, and I'll like put, a little piece of something in there and kind of do that every day. But it's been with me to several continents, and all around the US. And yeah, it's really interesting because when I open it and smell it, it like reminds me of the smell of all the places that I've been since 2019. So it's kind of cool. Yeah, so this one, it just has carrots in it right now. But it's, at this point, it's such, perpetual brine pickles for anybody who makes like pausai or anything like that, which are just ferments. So perpetual brine ferments are just ferments where you keep adding vegetables to the brine, rather than making a new brine every time. One of the benefits to that is that it will pickle them more quickly. I mean, at this point, this one, I can throw carrots in there and it's like, I mean, like they just ferment so fast. It's very energetic ferment.
Well, that's the epitome of relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, and then so this one's kind of fun. So this one is, I made a malt vinegar out of purple barley, and it's like pink. It turned, so the beer itself, when I made it, was still kind of purpley, and then once it turned into vinegar, it's like this kind of like a rosé color, which is kind of fun.
Nice.
And then the last thing I have down here is this. So this is the first time I've made this one. This is something that Sander posted about a few weeks ago, where he learned to make a sourdough discard cauliflower pickle from somebody else. And so basically, yeah, you make the brine and add in sourdough starter as an inoculant. And I put in some garlic in there because I wanted garlic in there. Yeah, it smells good. I'm excited to try it.
Beautiful. So it was just, can we just go through the process of that? I think
Yeah.
It would be helpful because I know it's simple, but if you could just go through the steps of what you added, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, so for this one, I think, so I just dumped sourdough starter in there. I'll be honest, I didn't measure it. It's probably like about a quarter cup. Something like that. And then, obviously the whole cauliflower florets. This is probably a 2% brine, and so what that means is 2% of salt in the water.
So you made the salt brine,
Yeah.
separately.
Yeah, so I mixed the salt brine and this and the sourdough together.
Okay.
And I can't remember if his original recipe used salt or not. I used salt in this one. Just to see. Yeah, and what's interesting about it is now that I've shaken it up, it's all cloudy again, but it was really clear and
yeah, when you first held it up, it was very clear. I was like, what are those potatoes? That was my first thought.
Yeah, so I'm excited to try that one, but it's, it's I wanted to share it because it's such a good example of, no matter how long we've been fermenting stuff, we always learn new techniques and new things. Like you will never stop learning about fermentation.
Well, and that's a great example of, again, utilizing your sourdough for something and utilizing, so that inoculants can be transferable. So you can go, oh, I'm going to do this. I'll try this inoculant. And it's just, yeah, it's the never ending projects and experiments and possibilities.
Yeah, there's something I've been experimenting with that's still very early stages. Like I don't have a written recipe for it yet or anything, but so I've been making, nut milks, like I don't make almond milk as much because I try not to use almonds, but like pecan milk and stuff, like a decent amount. But for some reason right now, I just have an insane amount of dried beans. I have so many dried beans, more than I would ever be able to eat. And so I was like, what am I gonna do with all these beans? And so I started experimenting with making bean milks. Because I was like, well, soy milk, bean milk, right? So like other bean milks. And so I made black-eyed pea milk this morning. It's actually really good. I made adzuki bean milk. And so I've just been kind of experimenting with that, and then experimenting with, because obviously you don't want to eat raw beans, but I feel bad throwing all those solids away. So I've been trying to figure out how to work with them. And something that I'm experimenting with is sourdough discard and then like sauerkraut brine as inoculants to ferment those little bean bits and make like a vegan like Parmesan situation. And that's been kind of fun to play with. So we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, that sounds really fun. I know when we were talking about miso, one of the things that's intrigued me is that there's lots of different beans you can utilize when you're to ferment. And one I hadn't seen a whole lot of were black beans. So I started playing with making black bean miso, and it definitely has a unique flavor, but I like it. And so, I mean, really, I think the encouraging, hopefully everybody's catching the ball on this, that really experiment, have fun, and read books like Julia's book and Sandra Katz's book, and then get that foundation and then just go and play and experiment because there's so much room for it. And I know, I think we're at a point where we probably want to start taking some questions. I think there might be some in the chat, and then we could open it up. Maria, are there questions that you want to throw our way, or anybody wants to ask their own question directly?
Amy just asked if you had any experience with tempeh, and can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I've made tempeh for a few years. I actually just finished writing a tempeh recipe for a friend's book, which is very exciting. So I find tempeh to be very easy, easy to make. It's also a great place to experiment. Linda talked about you can use black beans instead of soybeans for miso. Well, same thing with tempeh. My favorite tempeh I've ever made is with black-eyed peas. A trend you'll notice with anything I make with beans is that I do a lot of black-eyed peas. My family are Southern. I live in the South. Like I am of this place. And that is reflected in my bean usage. And so, but I mean, black-eyed pea tempeh is like one of the best things I've ever tasted. So all of that is to say, that I highly recommend making it. You can get the starter from Cultures for Health and a number of other places, and those come with the directions I've used cultures for health many times. It's pretty easy to use, and yeah, I like them.
And that's the one that I also found easier than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be really complicated.
Yeah.
Got my feet wet at the residency with Sander Katz and then started making it. And I never liked store like commercial tempeh at all. But I fell in love with the homemade tempeh. So I really encourage people. It's not as hard as you would think. So
yeah, and the flavor, I mean, just so much better. So much better.
right. And I know one of my classes we were making tempeh, and then we made tempeh Reubens for lunch, and it just really is they're it's quite versatile as a food for sure. Yeah. So any other questions, or anybody have their hand up, Maria? That
Yeah, Trisha wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, actually I had 3 quick questions about safety. So the first, so I've been doing fermenting for a couple of years now. I started with kombucha, then I did some kefir and vegetables. I tried kimchi a couple times, and I always have a problem with the kimchi with a little bit of mold. Like it'll be one little spot of mold getting on the side. And everybody says if you have one spot of mold, you have to toss the whole entire thing. And I'm thinking, my grandma was Polish. She made sauerkraut. I can't imagine her throwing away a whole vat of sauerkraut for her family of 6 because of one little thing of mold. So in your opinion, is it okay to skim part of it, or do you really have to throw away the entire thing?
So I always encourage people to trust their own best judgment with that. For me personally, I'll tell you what I would do for myself, and I encourage you to do what you think is best. What I would do for myself is I would base it on one, the color of the mold. You know, if we have something like a red color or bright colors, then no. If it's a little bit of white fuzzy mold, I find that to be fine. And I would scoop that off, and I would maybe scoop off a layer of the kimchi. But then most importantly, what I would do is I would make sure everything was weighted. And so one of the ways that I do that is I leave whole cabbage leaves out during the processing, and I'll fold them and put them on top so that they hold all those little bits of cabbage.
Yeah, I always seem to have one little piece that manages to come out, finds its way up.
Yeah.
Okay, and then my second question is, you had mentioned reusing the brine, and I was always told that you have to dump the brine after each and every time. Right now I have some pickled red onions in my fridge that are getting low. I'm like, man, I gotta throw this brine away and start all over. So I can reuse it? That's
you
okay?
can reuse it. One thing I would encourage you to do is to check the salinity of it, because the salinity will change as you pickle things in it. It'll get more diluted. With lacto-ferment brines, you want it to taste salty like the sea, roughly. Like you want it to have about that level of salinity. Sure. So if you need to add some more salt, add some more salt. But yeah, it should be fine.
Oh, cool. Okay. And then my last question is for Linda. So Linda, I actually took your class 3 years ago almost at the Wellspring. It was a gift for the holidays class. It was super fun. We made a whole bunch of different things, felted soap and all kinds of things. And one of the things we made was a garlic honey. So we had crushed up some garlic and put it in honey, and somehow got pushed to the back of my fridge. And then we moved recently, and I found it. I'm like, oh, here's that honey, garlic honey I made 3 years ago. Is it still good?
I think what Julia said is really important, is, smelling it, tasting.
Yeah, it smells good, actually.
But generally speaking, honey does not go bad, and garlic doesn't either. So I would, especially if you have it in your fridge, I would find it hard to believe that it would be.
Yeah, no, it looks and smells good, but I'm like, I want to make sure there's no botulism or anything lurking in there.
Well, see, the thing is, garlic carries botulism spores. And if it were growing botulism, you would know, like the lid would buckle or something.
Oh, sure.
So, and the spores, adults, of course, we can, pass the spores and we have no problems. But if there was botulism actually growing in it, you would know, and it would have a lot of, it would be more liquidy and water like
Okay.
if that were happening.
Are you doing that class again? That was so fun.
Yes, I am. Yes. Yeah, just email me and I can let you know about it. So,
Yeah,
and I'm actually going to be doing a fermentation immersion at the Midwest Women's Herbal Conference as a pre-conference.
okay.
Hands-on. So
Yeah,
we'll
fermentation camp.
yes, fermentation camp. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Good to see you.
That's it.
Yes, thank you. Anything else? Anybody else?
There are a bunch of questions that just came into the chat.
If you have any capacity to consolidate them, if they're at all similar, that would be.
Yeah, let's see. So how about for someone whose gut isn't very quote unquote strong and would be considered damp and cold in traditional Chinese medicine, and for whom moderate amounts of inulin causes moderate discomfort, more than moderate discomfort, other than starting with small amounts of ferments and working up, is there a particular kind of ferment you recommend starting with?
Well, one thing is when you think about being cool or cold, lean toward warming things, of course. So like the fire cider and small amounts, it makes sense building up. Usually it seems that people need to inoculate your gut just like you inoculate your ferments, and sometimes eating too many ferments all at once, if you haven't eaten many ferments, can be distressing. But usually if you build up and you eat a lot of diversity of ferments as well, that can be really helpful. And small amounts of miso soup, which you don't want to boil the miso in the soup, but having it be warm. Those are things that I think of, and I don't know, Julie, if you can think of anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think fire cider is a good recommendation. Fermented hot sauces. I mean, even if it's something that you end up cooking into something, like let's say using a yogurt in a cooked sauce or something, just having the ferment in there, we're learning more about postbiotics, which is something I don't personally know a ton about, but we're starting to see research on that. Even just having a probiotic food that's been cooked is healthier for you than having the non-probiotic version. So that's something I really want to.
Way more digestible, there's no doubt about that, because that's one of the things ferments do, is make the food more digestible. Even after you bake a loaf of bread, the bread is more digestible. So absolutely.
What about what is the average lifespan of fermented foods?
So there is no average across all fermented foods, I would say. I mean, it really, if we think about fermented foods, these are foods that were made to preserve things. And so we tend to have a pretty long lifespan on them. In some cases, they may shift into something else. So if we think about beer, if you leave beer out and expose it to air, it's going to eventually become vinegar. Same with wine. Sauerkraut will get more sour, and it's never going to turn into something that's not sauerkraut, but it will become more sauerkrauty. It may get mushy. I would say it really depends. I mean, one of my friends just cracked open a thing of miso that she started making in 2017, and she just started eating it yesterday. So, all of that is to say there's not really an average. I mean, you can, if you feel like it tastes good, and this is where your sense is guiding you, is so important. If it tastes good to you, that's a good time to put it in the fridge, because that slows down the fermentation, and then just eat it. And as long as it's, still tastes good and still looks good, that's all that matters.
Cool. Danielle and Dwayne, you have a couple questions in here, and I'm wondering if you would want to unmute yourself and just come on and ask instead of me reading all of it.
I find this fascinating. I'm so sorry I'm about the entire show late. So you may have already addressed this at the very beginning. I got my time wrong. but I'll certainly be tuning in to future things like this. So thank you for having this. My
And
question.
we will be sending you a recording. So
Awesome. Oh, that's amazing. Thank you. Gosh, we're all lucky. I'm trying to wrap my head around the basics of fermentation, and I certainly don't want to take everyone's time if you've already addressed this. And there's a power of Google that I'm already on and looking up these basic questions. But as far as I can understand, you can ferment with bacteria or yeast. Is that correct? One or the other?
Or both.
Or both. Interesting. Okay. And is there a difference health-wise in using one over the other? Say you're making a beverage, and why does yeast, I feel like this is elementary school fermentation, I know, but why does yeast produce alcohol and bacteria no alcohol?
So I think these are great things, like you said, to dive in directly with some books and other resources to get some more specifics, but a good broad overview. So you can ferment with bacteria, yeast, mold, like the koji we were talking about earlier. And so basically, it's less about the health benefits of each and more that each has a different function. So yeast will produce alcohol, bacteria, like lactic acid bacteria will acidify a brine. They serve different functions. Sometimes those functions overlap. If we think about beet kvass, for example, that is a carbonated beverage that is like yeasty and bacteria-y. Typically, because our environment has all these microbes in it, you're not going to get just one or the other. But yeah, I mean, they have different functions. You can get, if you need to get inoculants, you can buy those online. Cultures for Health is one that I usually recommend, just because they have very easy to follow instructions for beginners. But there's a ton of different places out there. And then, of course, there's a lot of different good books too. For beginner materials, I really like Kirsten and Christopher Shockey's Fermented Vegetables book is a good place to start, just kind of as a very base level vegetable making book.
Thank you so much. And then if they all have different functions, would one be better for the gut than the other, say a kvass over a kombucha?
So again, this is going to depend more on your body than anything. I mean, the thing that's best for your gut is to have a diversity of microbes and a diversity of ferments.
And really microbes of place, because making your own ferments is going to give you a lot stronger, more robust digestive system than purchasing and getting microbes that are in something that was created in a more sterile kitchen. Having the diversity from your environment, because you're part of your environment, is a big piece of it. And one other thing I like to tell people is, we sometimes in the natural health world, people think yeast is the enemy or that fungi is the enemy, but there's this whole new awareness about the microbiome and how fungi is important to the metabolization of microbes and how they interact, and so are yeasts. But in moderation, some of the yeasts can become problematic. Like candida is very opportunistic. Everybody has candida, but it's when your microbiome is out of whack that it becomes opportunistic. So I think it's important when it comes to gut health, the diversity, like you're saying, Julia, is so important, and a diversity of place as much as possible. And then realizing that some of these things, bacteria should be the most predominant, but these other factors are important as well to gut health. So, yes.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. One last question, and then there are 100 other people I know. Do you suggest steering clear of canned fermented products, meaning canned in aluminum as cans are lined with plastic? Is there any risk of an acidic product like that breaking down that lining and getting into the product?
I mean, I'm less worried about the lining than the fact that a canned ferment is no longer probiotic. And so if you're going to be eating probiotic foods, you might as well get living probiotic foods.
How were they able to be labeled as probiotic, like the kombuchas on the shelf?
I don't know.
Okay,
That's outside of my
okay.
expertise.
Well,
No,
and
it's just-
you know, sometimes I don't know about you, Julia, but I say to people, I know a lot more about ferments that I make in my kitchen than I do about products on the shelf.
Yeah, exactly. I'm definitely not a commercial ferment expert.
Yeah.
Can you just one last thing explain why they're not once they enter a can?
Because, well, so canning, if you heat process them, it kills the microbes.
Okay, basic. Thank you. You guys are amazing.
Thank you.
So I think we're coming toward the end of our time. Maria, do you want to
Yeah.
take it from here? I want to but I will say, Julia, thank you so much. This was such a rich, enjoyable
Yeah.
conversation. And we, as the Midwest Women's Herbal, we just love partnering with amazing, strong, smart, wise women who are nourishing the world. So we have a question we like to ask people at the end of our meeting. And the question is kind of rhetorical, but if you have a short response to it, what if nourishment works? What if it works? How would you respond to that question?
I mean, if nourishment works, since I think of everything in terms of community as like our seen and our unseen community, nourishment to me would mean that we would be nourishing both communities.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for
Thank
writing
you.
the book. Thank you for spending this time with us. And I'm going to hand it over to Maria.
Thank you, ladies. That was an amazing conversation. I know I'm not alone when I say I've learned a lot tonight. So cool. Love learning about ferments, and I really want to make miso now. I really want to make miso. We love it. And thank you for everyone attending tonight. We appreciate your time and attention and your participation. So let's give away some goodies, shall we? Who's ready to win something? All right. So we are going to give away Julia's book first. And how this is going to work is Jill is going to use a random number generator. And we're going to pull a number at random. And I will announce the name connected to that number on our spreadsheet. And if you're here, I want you to raise your hand. And then we'll be contacting you. We will email you for your address to give to Story Publishing so they can send out your book. Okay.
And thank you to them for donating.
That? Jill, you want to go ahead and give me a number, and I'll see if I can find that spreadsheet.
You bet. All right. The first number I got is 56.
Yes. Thank you to Story Publishing. Definitely. Jill, are you picking a number?
Yeah. 56 is the first one I got.
56. That is, sorry, I have to take my glasses off to see this. Kelly Gray Meisner. Kelly, are you here? Going once, going twice. Okay, go ahead and pick another.
All right. The second number I got is 335.
335. You can see I need new glasses. Pardon me while I smash my face into the camera to see this number. Did you say, what was it again?
335.
335. 335. Sally Powell. Are you here, Sally? You can go ahead and unmute yourself or jump in the chat. Sally Powell, going once, going twice. All right. Let's try it again.
Third's a charm.
3 times a charm.
All right. The next number I got is 504.
504. Callie Bohm. Are you here, Callie? No, no Callie. Okay.
All right. 554.
554. Laura Flint. Laura Flint, are you here? How about how about we try something else?
Yes.
Yeah.
How about I'm going to flick my mouse over the list, and wherever it stops, that's who's going to win.
That's a good idea.
Cool.
All right, Laura Schmidt.
You're smoking.
Hello, I'm
Laura,
here. Yay!
yay!
All
It's
right,
hard.
Laura.
There are 90 women here, but over 700 signed up. So that could have taken a long time. So,
Yes.
all right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
Congratulations. You're going to love it.
Congratulations.
you.
All right. I'm just writing your name down so I don't forget. All right. Congratulations, Laura. All right. So what is next? We are going to...
We're going to give away the fermentation learning module.
All right. So, Linda, do you want to talk a little bit about the classroom?
Sure. What we're going to be giving away is part of our brand new classroom space, and we're going to have audio and video learning modules from women teaching from all over the world. One of the teachers in that module is Jessica Prentice, who wrote a beautiful book called Full Moon Feast, some workshops from me, and then you go through the modules, and then you get a question and answer time with myself and or guest instructors. And this is a classroom that we're opening that's going to have a lot of different modules. And this particular one that we're going to offer to you is called Fantastic Fermentation. And then there'll be other ones on wild edibles, on all different types of topics. So keep your eyes out. We'll be sending you some information about that space going forward.
All right. So let's go ahead and give away that class. So I'm going to do the one thing again. I'm going to scroll right there. How about Caroline?
Oh, I'm here.
All right.
Sorry.
Caroline, what's your last name?
Morris. Sorry. Morris.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Caroline. We'll be contacting you to give you registration information and code.
Okay, thank you.
Nice. All right. That was fun. Congratulations, everyone. We'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight's class, and especially Julia and Linda for such an amazing and insightful conversation. It's so much fun, and we look forward to seeing all of you in the future at Midwest Women's Herbal events, whether it's in our own hands or in the classroom, or this spring at the Herbal Conference, which we will be launching registration for mid-December. So keep an eye out for that. And just one more last quick announcement. Our In Our Own Hands series right now is in early bird registration phase, and that will end on December 1st. So if you use your coupon code that you got in your email box and you register before December 1st, you get the deepest discount. And so it makes it just so much easier to join and have a great time with us. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and have a wonderful night. Do you have any last words, Linda?
Just want to thank everybody for being here, and also the team for holding this space. This is a space that gets held and curated and produced, and it gives us a chance to really have that deep conversation. So thank you to the team for doing that. And just one last big thank you to Julia. Really enjoyed being with you tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it was really amazing. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
All right. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.